Right now on Morning News Now, President Trump facing the fallout as his trade war intensifies. Canada and the European Union striking back with retaliatory tariffs, targeting billions of dollars worth of American-made goods.
Inflation is way down, and it's based on what we've done. If they charge us 25 or 20% or 10% or 2% or 200%, then that's what we're charging them. There's nothing more fair than that.
We have team coverage with reaction from Washington to Wall Street. Also this morning, controversial cuts to the Department of Education. The agency carved in half. Plus a major setback with just 1 day left to head off a government shutdown. The Democrats say a funding bill to keep things running won't pass the Senate. And first, there was fire, now fears of flooding. A storm packing torrential rain takes aim at the burn zones in Southern California. Well, back east, severe weather threatening states with snow, wind, and possible tornadoes. We're tracking it all. And it's far from a fairy tale. The controversies forcing Disney to scale back on premiere plans for its newest film as that fairy tale collides with the real world. Good morning. Good to have you with us. I'm Joe Fryer. Savannah is on assignment. We begin this morning in Washington. Representatives from Canada are set to meet with U.S. officials today. They hope to bring down the temperature in that escalating trade war. Overnight, new Canadian tariffs on American goods went into effect. It's retaliation for President Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, which went into effect yesterday. All this as protests grow over Elon Musk's slashing of the federal government workforce, with new fallout over the 1,300 employees cut from the Department of Education. In a few moments, we'll hear from NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung. Before that, let's get to our Washington correspondent, Alice Barr. Alice, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. More uncertainty today between the trade war you just referenced and these government cuts, this time leaving parents with lots of questions as President Trump looks to reshape the American education system. Concern and confusion over the Trump administration's deep cuts to the Department of Education, slashing its workforce in half. While schools are largely funded and run at the state and local level, the federal education department protects students with disabilities, investigates discrimination cases, and helps low-income school districts. This retired teacher outraged.
Without the Department of Ed, there's a lot of America, especially rural America, where kids aren't really going to have a chance to break out of poverty.
Sharia Smith lost her job in Texas at one of 6 regional offices education officials say were shut down.
My family is now trying to figure out how we overcome the loss of my income.
President Trump wants to abolish the education department, though that would take an act of Congress. He defended the mass firing, saying this without evidence.
I feel very badly, but many of them don't work at all.
Wyoming superintendent of public instruction among those celebrating the changes.
Streamlining those funds to the states and putting us back in charge of our kids.
Even as protests against the Department of Government efficiency grow across the country, also escalating the Trump trade war.
The United States of America is going to take back a lot of what was stolen from it by other countries.
With top allies retaliating against the president's new tariffs on global steel and aluminum imports. The European Union announcing tariffs on everything from American beef to bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles. Canada slapping 25% tariffs on billions of dollars worth of American goods as the U.S. and Canada prepare for trade talks today. And back to the Education Department, union officials say the cuts there include half the staff at the Office of Civil Rights, which investigates discrimination complaints in schools, and eliminating 300 positions in the Federal Student Aid Office dealing with student loans and college tuition grants. That's all raising questions about how the remaining staff is going to keep up with the workload to keep meeting students' needs in a timely way. Back to you, Joe.
All right, Alice, thank you so much. Let's talk more trade with Brian Chung, who's been with us all week. Let's start with Canada, these retaliatory tariffs. What is it Canada is targeting now?
Yeah, and they followed the action from the EU where they were counteracting on about $28 billion of U.S. goods that are imported to the EU. Canada published a list of, get this, 539 different items ranging on everything from U.S. steel products to hand tools to video game consoles to umbrellas. The country of Canada is really saying that it was the United States that fired first. Take a listen to Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly explaining why they had to work to put these counteracting tariffs in place.
Canada is not the one driving up the cost of your groceries or of your gasoline or any of your construction. Canada is not the one putting your jobs at risk. Canada is not the one that is ultimately starting this war. President Trump's tariffs against you are causing that. And there are no winners in a trade war.
And we heard from President Trump speak broadly about some of the counteractions from the EU and also Canada, suggesting that he might do something to respond to those counteracting tariffs. What that might be, we don't really know. But of course, as we know, this is kind of just the beginning of this trade war that President Trump had promised on the campaign trail.
So clearly tensions are high, and that's the backdrop now as Canadian and U.S. officials meet. What can we realistically expect to come out of this meeting? Could things be reversed?
Yeah, meetings happening in Washington in person between some of those high-level officials. I do want to point to kind of what happened just as recently as earlier on this week. On Tuesday, there were conversations between Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick here in the United States and the Ontario Premier Doug Ford. When you remember that Canada wanted to, or specifically the province of Ontario wanted to levy that 25% surcharge on electricity that is used by Minnesota, New York, and also Michigan. After that conversation, the Ontario Premier backed off of that 25% surcharge. And then you also had the United States responding by no longer threatening that 50% tariff on steel and aluminum. They lowered it back down to 25%, which was implemented to every other country around the world just yesterday. So previous episodes of communication between the U.S. and Canada have resulted in some de-escalation. Can that happen again today? We'll have to see.
Let's talk about markets. Yesterday, the Dow was down a little, but other markets were higher. Is this because that the inflation report was a little better than expected? And then also, what are futures looking like for today?
Yes, as you mentioned yesterday, the Dow did close just a little bit in the red. The S&P 500 and the tech-heavy NASDAQ did close higher, which was certainly welcome news to Wall Street traders that had been seeing red across the screen basically for days leading up to that. As you'll recall, Monday was the worst day for stocks in 2025. But I do think that right now, as we're watching the story here, it was really inflation that led to some of those indexes recovering some gains yesterday. As of this morning on this Thursday, at least for right now, market futures basically about flat. So it could go either way today.
Flat is probably good news these days right now.
Exactly.
So, all right, Brian, thank you so much. Appreciate it. We are now less than 48 hours from a potential government shutdown, and lawmakers are not any closer to a spending deal. Senate Democrats say they will reject a government funding bill that House Republicans narrowly passed earlier this week. Now, if the Senate does pass the resolution, it would keep the government open through the end of September, but that won't happen without some Democrats jumping on board. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer explained why that won't happen.
Republicans chose a partisan path, drafting their continuing resolution without any input from congressional Democrats. Because of that, Republicans do not have the votes in the Senate to invoke cloture on the House CR.
NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin joins us again this morning with the latest developments. Julie, good morning. So getting this through the Senate is tough because it requires 60 votes to advance. Republicans only control 53 seats. Why are Democrats a no vote right now?
Yeah, this was a surprise. Remember, when we talked yesterday morning, we thought that the House pressure, the fact that the House managed to pass this, would put so much pressure on those 8 Democrats that had to join Republicans in order to unlock the votes and pass this continuing resolution through the upper chamber. But Democrats met again for 2 hours behind closed doors. That followed another dramatic debate that they had the day before, trying to get on the same page with what to do, because historically Democrats are not the party of shutdowns. They've railed against them over the last decade, but this time around, their base has been pressuring them to do something to counteract the Trump administration's actions and Elon Musk's actions in Doge, all the cuts, the layoffs, everything they've been doing. This is really their first test, and it appeared that Democrats came out of their meeting yesterday unified around one thing. It's that they would vote on a shorter-term continuing resolution, one that was introduced by the top Senate Democrat appropriator, Patty Murray, and they would not provide the votes for that longer-term House CR. There's a number of different ways that this could play out, but Senate Democrats at least united behind that fact, and some of those that we would thought would vote with Republicans like Senator Mark Warner, those in states that have large populations of federal workers, now saying no way to that longer-term CR.
So the clock is ticking. Is there a way lawmakers can reach some sort of deal to keep the government open before Friday night?
Well, there's a couple of possibilities here, and the top Republican in the Senate, John Thune, already said, hey, if they want an amendment vote on that shorter term CR, they meaning Democrats, we'll give it to them. But that's nothing more than a performance vote, because it would mean that 8 Democrats would have to join Republicans first in reaching that 60 vote threshold and getting on the bill so they can then debate it and try to amend it. If they do that, the amendment vote would definitely fail because Republicans aren't going to vote for it. Even Susan Collins, who was in favor of that shorter term process so that they can then build out a full year spending package instead of doing it in the stopgap fashion that they've been used to. Even she said now it's too late. We are a day away from this shutdown. And so Democrats really have 2 paths here. They either go along with that show vote, essentially, or they say we're shutting it down.
This is risky. Are Democrats comfortable with the idea of the government shutting down? I mean, who's going to own this?
It is extremely risky. And the thing is, the White House doesn't care if the government does shut down because of everything they've been doing and trying to reform it, trying to dismantle it from inside. Trump has made it very clear to his base on the campaign trail that the government is bad, that it needs reform. So then if Democrats own it and shut it down, Republicans can have it both ways. They can point fingers and say Democrats didn't provide the votes in the Senate. Remember, the House already passed it with largely Republican votes. And Democrats will lose as well because their base, while they're asking them to shut it down, historically, Democrats have not been the party of shutdowns. Shutdowns are not beneficial or helpful to anyone, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, especially at a time like this when the economy's not doing well. So many workers have already lost their jobs. It's just not going to be good.
Julie, while we have you, I do want to ask you about a Senate confirmation hearing set for today for Dr. David Weldon. The former Florida congressman is President Trump's nominee to head the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. What should we know about him?
Well, he has no experience in terms of leading bureaucracies like the CDC. He is a doctor. He was a member of Congress in the early 2000s. He actually sat on the relevant committees that help oversee the CDC, which is certainly helpful. He also led some controversial efforts, a push to research autism based on a debunked study, a British study. He also was critical of vaccines, even the MMR vaccine for measles. Of course, that is a hot topic right now. And his views definitely align with RFK, the Secretary of HHS, who Trump certainly promised on the campaign trail they would dismantle the system from the inside out. So it makes sense that someone like Weldon was nominated, but he is going to be grilled by the Senate Health Committee, which has some folks on it, even on the Republican side of the aisle, like Bill Cassidy, who's also a doctor who is very much in favor of vaccines. So you can expect that to happen. But all in all, Weldon, like RFK, like Trump's Surgeon General Pick and others, certainly fitting the bill of folks who've been critical of the system and want to dismantle it from the inside. All
right, Julie, thank you so much. This morning, pro-Palestinian activist Mahmoud Khalil is in what some legal experts are calling legal purgatory. On Wednesday, a federal judge heard arguments about his detention, but the judge did not immediately make a decision. Demands for Khalil's release are growing louder. Major demonstrations were held in front of the New York courthouse during yesterday's hearing. NBC's Laura Jarrett has the latest.
Release Mahmoud right now! Outside a New York City courthouse demands for the release of Mahmoud Khalil.
If they come for Mahmoud today, they will come for every other green card holder.
Khalil, a leader of the pro-Palestinian protests that rocked Columbia University last spring, arrived on a student visa and became a permanent resident last year, according to court papers. Now he's facing deportation at the direction of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, accusing him of supporting Hamas.
This is not about free speech. This is about people that don't have a right to be in the United States to begin with.
The Trump administration relying on a law authorizing the Secretary of State to deport any green card holder whose presence or activities in the United States would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences. Khalil, an Algerian citizen of Palestinian descent, was set to graduate in May, but his lawyers say immigration agents apprehended him Saturday night at his home in New York in front of his wife, who is due with their child next month. Then quickly moved him to a detention center in Louisiana, where he remains. His legal team in court saying he has no criminal record and has not been charged with any crime.
What happened to Mahmoud Khalil is nothing short of extraordinary and shocking and outrageous. It should outrage anybody who believes that speech should be free in the United States of America.
All this as President Trump threatens to punish any school that allows, quote, illegal protests, promising others will face the same fate as Khalil.
I think we ought to get them all out of the country. They're troublemakers. They're agitators. They don't love our country. We ought to get them the hell out.
Our thanks to Laura Jarrett for that report. Khalil's attorneys are trying to expedite his release, but after yesterday's hearing in New York, it's not entirely clear which court has the jurisdiction to resolve this fight. A powerful storm is pummeling Southern California, and officials are warning about the potential for dangerous flooding and mudslides. Those who live on land scorched by January's wildfires are most at risk. Just a month ago, another storm system dropped intense rain that resulted in evacuation orders and life-threatening mudslides. Well, today, people living near the burn scar in the community of Sierra Madre are once again under evacuation orders. Reporter Lauren Coronado from NBC Los Angeles takes us behind the scenes of the Emergency Operations Center.
There was a lot of mud flowing everywhere. I mean, I saw trash cans flowing down the street on Baldwin. It was really just amazing. But hopefully it won't be as bad, but we'll be ready if it is.
Jonathan Blakesley is talking about last month's storm. He lives here in Sierra Madre, just up against the foothills.
We're doing better now. They're doing a lot of work to really pull the debris out of the basins and that kind of thing. There's trucks lined up here every morning.
He's one of more than 2,200 people under evacuation warnings here in Sierra Madre and is prepared to go if he has to. Another nearly 1,700 neighbors have already been ordered to evacuate, according to James Carlson, senior public works analyst for the city of Sierra Madre.
A lot of this is because of the burn scars, where the burns happened.
He gave us a behind-the-scenes look at the Emergency Operations Center, a hub for critical coordination and decision-making ahead of an emergency situation. In this case, the chance for another round of dangerous mudslides.
If there's an active mud flow, if there's something coming down, they will not respond during an active mud flow. There won't be any police, there won't be any ambulances, there won't be any search and rescue during that active flow. We might even find that the road becomes impassable after the flow. So that's one of the main reasons it's very important that our residents actually get out.
Our thanks to Lauren Coronado for that report. Evacuation warnings and orders in Sierra Madre are scheduled to be lifted by 6 p.m. tonight. We've got more on California's soaking rains and some heavy winds coming to the East Coast. Meteorologist Angie Lastman is here to give us a rundown on the West Coast weather conditions and more. Angie, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. We've got a whole lot going on, all from the same storm system here, and it's going to last for some folks into the coming days. So let's start with what we're dealing with right now from that system. It's the 21 million people under these flood alerts. You can see some flash flood warnings centered across parts of Southern California, specifically Los Angeles at this hour because of all the heavy rain we've already seen. And there is still some ongoing rain. Notice this big batch of moisture that's still kind of sitting over this same region. They've already received a good dose of rain yesterday and into the overnight hours, and they're going to see this kind of lasting through at least the morning hours. There's improvements to come, especially as we get into the later parts of today and beyond, but that system will shift a little farther to the east. That means the southwest, the desert southwest, really starts to see some of the rain and potentially snow across parts of the Rockies. We will still be looking at the potential for some localized flooding across those regions. As we get into tomorrow, though, we really ramp up the potential for severe weather. Now, this doesn't really look to get started until late into the day. So we're looking at specifically late afternoon, evening hours, and potentially overnight hours, which always brings us concern when it comes to those tornadoes developing, which is an impact that we do see on the table for folks across the middle of the country tomorrow. Looking beyond that, Saturday, still the soaking rain from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. We've got a tornado risk as well for Saturday. Tennessee Valley and Gulf Coast is where that will be centered. And then even Sunday, it's rain and those severe storms on the table as we round out our work week. The flash flood outlook today for California, Riverside down to San Diego, that's where we see that slight risk. It does go all the way to the coast, though, and we'll pick up maybe another ½ 1/2 inch, 1/4 of an inch in some of these spots, and up to 2 inches in a few of these locations. As we look ahead at what we're dealing with for Friday for severe weather, this is where we're really concerned. This could potentially be a significant outbreak. We've got the wind gusts up to 75 miles per hour, but those tornadoes are going to be likely, and you can see kind of where the bullseye is. We've got Kirksville, St. Louis, Paducah, Memphis, Jackson, all included in that, but it does include Little Rock and Nashville as well. And we've got the risk for some large tornadoes in that same kind of batch of area. So something to keep in mind. Looking ahead Saturday, the risk shifts. Now we've got 51 million people under that risk. Wind gusts still going to be the main impact, but again, those tornadoes will be likely. We could see some strong tornadoes at that EF2 or higher. Birmingham, Montgomery, Jackson, Mobile, New Orleans all have that potential for Saturday plans. And then, of course, Joe, this shifts a little farther to the east. Not quite as significant for Sunday, but still that system will be impacting folks for their weekend plans.
All right. Angie, thank you so much. Appreciate it. The 2 astronauts who've been in space far longer than they ever imagined will have to stay in orbit a bit longer. It's because last night NASA and SpaceX scrubbed the launch of a rocket that is supposed to bring them home.
Hey, for awareness, team needs a couple more minutes here, wrapping up this hydraulics issue. At this time, we are standing down from today to further address hydraulic release data.
Now, mission managers are trying to determine when to try again. NBC News senior correspondent Tom Costello was there for the attempt last night, joins us live from the Kennedy Space Center. So, Tom, what happened yesterday, and what are you hearing about the timeline for another try?
Yeah, so they're going to try again tomorrow, Joe, 7:03 p.m. Eastern time here at the Kennedy Space Center. They say the winds right now and through the day will likely not make it possible to try. And in the meantime, they really got to understand what the problem is. It has to do not with the Crew 10 rocket itself, not with the Falcon 9 rocket. The problem is with a hydraulic issue on the clamp arm that reaches out and holds that rocket to the launch pad, right, to the structure on the ground. Somehow they have a hydraulic issue that they need to solve. And when they finally do, that will allow, hopefully, Crew 10 to go up. Now, Crew 10 has 4 astronauts on board. They will dock with the International Space Station. That Crew 10 spaceship will stay. It will not bring Sonny and Butch home. Crew 9's spaceship, which has been docked there since September, that will then bring Sonny and Butch and the other 2 astronauts home. We're now looking at, if they lift off tomorrow night, probably they would splash down next Wednesday off the coast of Florida, either on the Gulf or in the Atlantic. We simply don't know yet. But in the meantime, engineers have to understand why they have this hydraulic issue with a clamp holding the rocket to the launch pad. They've got to fix that. And once they fix it, hopefully Crew 10 will be able to launch. Again, Friday night is the next plan.
So, Tom, after 9 months in space, perhaps another 2 days isn't a huge deal for Butch and Sonny, but what does this delay mean for them, and really, what does it mean for SpaceX?
Well, I was just thinking, yeah, not such a big deal for you and me, but for them, it may be a big deal, right? I mean, my gosh, they've been there 9+ months already. For them, listen, it's just business as usual. They are part of Crew 9, part of the space station crew, and they have assignments, regularly keeping up with the station, running science experiments. And it's a full-time job. That's why you've got multiple astronauts and cosmonauts on board constantly. America will not leave the space station abandoned, and that is why they have had to keep Butch and Sonny and the other crew members up there since September. The hope is that they come back, as I mentioned, next Wednesday. But we talked recently to both Butch and Sonny about staying so long, and they have a pretty good attitude.
We came up prepared to stay long, even though we planned to stay short. That's what we do in human spaceflight. That's what your nation's human spaceflight program is all about, planning for unknown, unexpected contingencies.
We're living up here in this very unique place it gives you an amazing perspective, not only, out the window, obviously, but also just on how to solve problems.
Yeah, Sonny's talked about how much
more to come here on Morning News Now. Later this hour, it's being called powerful and problematic. We're back now with new developments in the crisis in the Middle East. This morning, Hamas says it has entered into new talks that will hopefully lead to the second phase of the Gaza ceasefire deal. For now, the fighting does continue. 6 more Palestinians were killed in the West Bank by Israeli forces. Thousands in Gaza are also facing a water crisis after Israel cut electricity to the area. NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley joins us now from Tel Aviv with the latest. Matt, good morning. What can you tell us about this fighting we're seeing in the West Bank?
Yeah, good morning, Joe. Well, those casualties you just mentioned, they're the latest of dozens. There's been about 50 people who've been killed ever since this sprawling operation started, Israeli operation started more than 7 weeks ago in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. It's focused on the cities and the refugee camps in Jenin and Tulkarm, and areas where we're really seeing a lot of fighting over the past couple of weeks. This is a situation that is getting worse and worse. We've been seeing about 40,000 people displaced from those refugee camps in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And so this is a situation, the West Bank. I keep saying the Gaza Strip, but this is the West Bank. And this is a situation that international human rights groups and aid agencies are saying is growing worse and worse by the day.
All right, Matt, let's talk about Gaza. More than 600,000 Gaza residents are now facing a clean water crisis after Israel cut electricity to parts of Gaza. How are residents there coping, and what is it going to take to get the power restored?
Yeah, a very dire situation there. Now, the United Nations had said just a couple of days ago that 9 out of 10 Gazans have no access to clean water. And the problem is that this comes about a week, or nearly a week, since the Israelis cut off electricity to a desalinization plant that is crucial for purifying the water that comes from the sea and that is provided to many civilians in the Gaza Strip. That was done essentially as a punishment or as a sort of stick or carrot to try to get Hamas to accede to the negotiations that are now going on in Doha to try to extend the peace treaty, the treaty that had been going on there and that had been bringing some modicum of peace to the Gaza Strip for the past several weeks. Those negotiations don't appear to, have a lot of optimism surrounding them, despite the fact that the U.S. has sent the U.S. Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who is beginning negotiations there. But the fact is that without electricity to that desalination plant, a lot of the people in the Gaza Strip are going to be suffering from drinking brackish water, which is water, fresh water mixed with salt water. And that, of course, is very unhealthy.
Yeah. So, Matt, let's talk about the next phase of these talks. As you just mentioned, the White House's envoy, Steve Witkoff, is in Qatar to join these indirect talks between Israel and Hamas. What should we know about these meetings?
Yeah, these meetings are, as I mentioned, there's a lot of pessimism around them. The fact is that Steve Witkoff, he's coming to Doha to try to basically restart negotiations that are at an impasse. The Israelis want to see an extension of the first phase of that treaty, which would involve more exchanges of hostages in the Gaza Strip for Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, whereas Hamas has said that they want to move on to the second phase as outlined in the treaty as it was inked back in late January, and that would see a more permanent truce in the Gaza Strip and eventually the full withdrawal of the Israeli military from the Gaza Strip. Now, the Israelis have said that they are totally opposed to that. They don't want to see a withdrawal. They don't want to withdraw their troops until Hamas has been totally destroyed in the Gaza Strip. So this puts them completely at odds with each other. And the fact that we've heard these revelations that the United States is speaking directly to Hamas now, that hasn't necessarily injected any optimism into a process that still looks to be stalling and that still looks to be setting both sides on a collision course toward possibly a renewed war in the Gaza Strip.
All right, Matt Bradley with the latest. Matt, thank you so much. We have an update on a story we brought you yesterday about an attack on a train in northern Pakistan hijacked by an insurgent militant group. Earlier this week, the insurgents blew up the train track, then began a 2-day standoff with Pakistani security forces. The train passengers that were being held hostage are now free after a deadly raid by Pakistani commandos. We get the latest from NBC's Raf Sanchez.
This handout video from a Pakistani separatist group appears to show the moment militants blew up a railway track in southwestern Pakistan before opening fire on a passenger train. You see here people gathering by the train's side before hundreds were taken hostage, according to Pakistani security officials, triggering a dramatic rescue operation. This passenger says everyone was crying, passengers shouting, the sound of gunfire everywhere. The train traveling from Quetta to the northern city of Peshawar was attacked Tuesday, killing 11 people. More than 400 passengers were on board, including 214 soldiers and security personnel, according to the Pakistani army. The insurgents, armed with rockets, grenades, and guns, separated law enforcement personnel and began taking small groups of passengers hostage into the mountains, Pakistani officials say. Security forces then launched a daring and dangerous rescue operation, saying it freed over 300 passengers over the past 2 days. Militants wearing suicide vests surrounded hostages, using them as human shields, officials say. This man says, "We were told not to look back. I just kept walking without looking back to save my family's lives." The Baloch Liberation Army, an armed ethnic militant organization, took responsibility for the attack, using hostages to negotiate the release of Baloch political prisoners. After a 2-day standoff, Pakistani security forces said they killed all 50 assailants, but 21 hostages were killed during the operation. The Pakistani Prime Minister condemned the attack, calling it a cowardly act. The BLA is seeking independence for Baluchistan, an oil and mineral-rich province bordering Afghanistan and Iran. It's also home to the country's ethnic Baloch minority. The violence in Baluchistan has been surging since 2021, when U.S. forces withdrew from Afghanistan, allowing the Taliban to return to power. The provincial minister of Baluchistan saying it's a difficult time for the entire nation. Officials are trying their best to improve security. The BLA carries out frequent attacks against Pakistani security forces and has also attacked civilians in the past. But the train hijacking was a first of its kind, an end to the latest violence in an ongoing battle. Raf Sanchez, NBC News.
New this morning, Russian President Vladimir Putin made a surprise visit to the Kursk region in the middle of talks to try and end the war in Ukraine. NBC News reporter Matt Bodner joins us from London with details and the latest international headlines. Matt, good morning.
Joe, good morning. This is Putin's first visit to Kursk since Ukraine moved into that territory back in August. It's also the first time in perhaps 20 years that we've seen him wear an actual military uniform. This particular outfit is usually seen on his generals. It appears to be a message to Ukraine and the United States that he, too, will get a say on how negotiations proceed from here. U.S. negotiators are on their way to Moscow to discuss that ceasefire proposal with Putin. Russia, unlike the United States, has kept its cards close. It's not clear what, if anything, the Kremlin is ready to give up in the name of peace. Putin has also said, in the meantime, Russia will complete its goal of expelling Ukrainian forces from Kursk. We're hearing just now from his foreign policy advisor, they're not interested in the ceasefire proposal. Moving along now to The Hague, former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has claimed full responsibility for his administration's war on drugs. The statement came as part of a video message posted on his Facebook page, and it's the first time we've heard from Duterte since he was arrested in Manila earlier this week. He was quickly flown to The Hague, where the International Criminal Court will try him for crimes against humanity. We'll wrap up this hour in the Vatican. Today is the 12th anniversary of Pope Francis's election as pontiff, and Catholics around the world are marking the occasion with prayers for his recovery. The Pope has been in hospital for about a month now, receiving treatment for double pneumonia and other infections. There have been serious concerns about his condition. The latest reports from his doctors continue to suggest improvement, though he continues to receive treatment in Rome's Gemelli Hospital. Joe?
All right, Matt, thank you so much. Coming up, an emotional plea from a man who spent more than 2 decades behind bars for a crime that he says he did not commit.
It's unconscionable to think that I will have to go back.
Up next, the decision that could send Andre Brown back to jail as soon as today. You're watching Morning News Now. We're back with one man's fight against a New York court that's trying to send him back to jail. Andre Brown served 23 years for 2 counts of attempted murder. It's a crime he says he did not commit. A judge vacated his sentence 2 years ago, but that decision has since been overturned. Now Andre is hoping that Governor Kathy Hochul will grant him clemency so he does not have to serve nearly 2 more decades in prison. NBC's Yasmin Basugian sat down with Andre and his family hours before he was due to surrender.
Andre Brown is a father and a husband, and he served 23 years of a 40-year sentence for attempted murder, a crime he insists he never committed. 2 years ago, that conviction was vacated, and he became a free man. But that decision was recently overturned, and he was ordered to surrender and for potentially another 18 years in prison.
It's unconscionable to think that I will have to go back.
I sat across from Andre and his wife as they became emotional.
I will have to leave my beautiful family, They know that I'm innocent.
How are you feeling, Tamika?
Sad, but still hopeful. Because I know there's a glimmer of hope that can still happen.
And their hope arrived as I drove back from our interview in a stunning turn of events. We got the call from Andre's attorney that he'd been granted a temporary 30-day adjournment, while New York Governor Kathy Hochul considers his application for clemency.
God is amazing.
Andre was convicted on 2 counts of attempted murder in the Bronx, locked up for more than 2 decades until he was released in 2022. His conviction was vacated due to, quote, ineffective assistance of counsel.
I picked up something up for you. A moment that I can rewatch 1,000 times. It was just brilliant. Surprised both of them.
But on Christmas Eve, just a few months ago, Andre and his family learned an appellate court reinstated his conviction.
Totally devastated. Just my heart dropped all the way down to my feet.
He was in disbelief, and I was in disbelief, and I just started going crazy a little bit, just like what happens now?
Andre and Tamika met when they were children, and then they lost touch. They later reunited, married, and had a son while he was in prison.
I asked God, I'm a man with 40 years, what's going to be my legacy? And he answered, and he gave me my son, Andre.
Now his stepdaughter worries most about her brother if their dad has to go back to prison.
I don't want my brother to be a statistic, to grow up without a father in the house. I had that experience. It's not too good, especially he's a boy. He needs that male figure in his life.
Andre has always maintained his innocence. In prison, he began studying the law after his friend brought him to the law library.
He showed me the spine of the book, and on the spine of the book, it has a key. And he said, you see this key? You read, and you read. You're gonna get out of here. And that's all I did. From that point on.
Behind bars, he received his paralegal certification. And after being released in 2022, he worked for a judge, mentoring at-risk youth.
Do you think if you had to go back in for another sentence, you could survive it?
I think it would drive me crazy.
And he knows the dangers that wait for him on the inside, especially now. The New York State prison system is in crisis. 2,000 prison guards fired for failing to return to work after a weeks-long strike over working conditions. Recent high-profile deaths of incarcerated men being investigated and allegations of abuse. The National Guard even called in to fill the void. Andre's attorney, Oscar Michelin, still fights for his innocence. He says the time he served is enough.
Putting Andre back in prison serves absolutely no agenda of the criminal justice system. It doesn't make the streets any safer. It doesn't promote justice. It doesn't even promote vengeance because he's already served 23 years. As an attorney, I've never had a case with more evidence of innocence. And I've certainly never had a case that's a stronger petition for clemency.
Now their hope lies with the New York Governor, Kathy Hochul, to grant Andre clemency before his new court date on April 17th. The office offering us no comment on pending applications.
What do you want the governor to know right now?
I want the governor to know that she has the power, that we are leaning on her shoulders, that Lady Justice is blind. It is literally blind, but she has the ears to hear the cries of the people. And my family is crying out onto her to stop this nightmare.
Yasmin Vasugian, NBC News.
Coming up, troublesome technology, artificial intelligence taking your voice without your permission. And experts say there's not much you can do about it. Up next, the warning in an eye-opening new report. We're back with a new report that outlines the potential dangers of powerful AI voice cloning. An investigation from Consumer Reports is calling out voice cloning programs for not doing enough to stop people from easily impersonating others without their permission. In the past few years, we've seen some high-profile examples. In 2023, a track went viral that featured a fake Drake and The Weeknd. And last year, there was a fake President Biden message urging people not to vote. Here it is.
Voting this Tuesday only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again. Your vote makes a difference in November, not this Tuesday.
Let's talk more about this with editor-at-large at Tech Radar, Lance Ulanoff. Good to have you with us, Lance. This is such a big topic we keep talking about. So the researchers found that out of, the 6 leading AI voice cloning tools publicly available, 4 simply require you check a box saying that the person whose voice is being cloned had given authorization. Why do many experts argue that's just not enough?
Oh, it's definitely not enough. There's so many of these, and they're so easy to find on the App Store. We've got 11 Labs, Speechify, PlayKit, Lovo, Resemble. We've got a lot of them. And I can tell you that some of them ask you for nothing. They simply, you download them, you upload a video where someone is speaking, and you can then use their voice. I mean, it's that easy. And some of them aren't even charging. I know that 11 Labs is charging, Resemble is charging. And actually, Descript does ask for a consent comment from the person you're trying to clone. Like, they'd have to first say, I consent to this, and then you put that up, and then you could clone their voice. But the whole process of doing this is incredibly simple. I just yesterday downloaded one and cloned my own voice. Why I need a clone of my own voice, I don't know, but I didn't want to do it to anyone else.
And how did that sound when you did it? Did it sound like you?
It did, and I showed it. I made a couple other people listen, and they said, "Yeah, that really gets you." I mean, there's a little bit, depending on the different platforms. Sometimes, even that Biden one, you can notice it sounded a little artificial, but they get better every single day. The pace of AI development is on really like 3-month cycles. We get better models so quickly all the time. And it is. The easiest thing to clone is a voice as opposed to like a full video figure of a person.
Right. So some of the companies behind these tools give warnings about the consequences of abusing them. One, Resemble AI, told NBC it has implemented robust safeguards against deepfakes. What else are the companies saying about this?
I mean, they're all trying to do stuff. They're all trying to implement things. But, there are a lot of companies. A lot of these models are freely available. So some of them are saying absolutely nothing. And honestly, what we're hoping is that there'd be some more regulation, at least in the U.S., that would really start to force some of these companies to do something about it. But as you know, the Biden stuff that was in place was taken away almost as soon as Trump took office.
So there is audio detection software out there that's meant to point out the difference between a real voice and these deep fakes, but it's not fail-safe. So how can you just make sure what you're listening to is real?
Well, I think, you really have to go back to what are you hearing? People need to be, 1, better informed about what's actually going on. 2, they need to, if they hear, one of the biggest scams that's used for these cloned AI voices is where you're scamming a relative, right? Maybe it's an elderly relative, and they pick up the phone and they hear their grandson saying, I've been in an accident, I need money. And so you've got to talk to like your elderly parents, your aunts or uncles about this and say, look, if you ever receive such a call, please put the phone down and call me directly. Always go back to the source, the real voice if you can, because if it sounds terrible, if it sounds too good to be true, if it sounds confusing, it may be an AI voice.
Common sense comes in handy here. Lance, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Staying on tech, the FTC is going ahead with its antitrust probe of Microsoft. CNBC's Silvana Henao has that and some other money headlines. Silvana, good morning.
Hey, Joe, good morning to you. Yes, so the Federal Trade Commission is moving ahead with a broad antitrust probe of Microsoft that was opened in the final days of the Biden administration. Now, Bloomberg reports this could be a signal the agency's new chair is going to make scrutiny of tech giants a top priority. The FTC sent Microsoft a civil investigation demand late last year, which is similar to a subpoena. Now, the probe is reportedly focused on the company's AI operations and data centers. The CEO of Ferrari says the luxury sports car maker is drawing up contingency plans to counter the potential impact of President Trump's tariffs on European imports. He tells CNBC at the Converge Live conference in Singapore the company is watching what's going to happen in the next few weeks or months without providing specific details. Now, tariffs could have a major impact on the auto industry given the reliance on manufacturing in several countries. Analysts say Ferrari could be well positioned to pass on any increase in prices as it exclusively makes its cars in Italy. And Sonic is celebrating a staple of the state and county fair, the corn dog. The fast food chain is offering 99-cent corn dogs on Saturday. That's in honor of National Corn Dog Day. Now, the item typically sells for about $3.50. Sonic added corn dogs to its menu in the late 1950s and has traditionally lowered the price on the food's annual holiday, Joe. I got to tell my little sister about this. She loves corn dogs.
Thank goodness we were all looking for a way to celebrate
She
Saturday,
can have mine.
and now there it is.
There it
Savannah.
is. Got it.
Coming up, far from a fairy tale, controversy surrounding Disney's newest film before it even hits theaters. When we come back, why the company is now scaling back some of its premiere plans. This is Morning News Now. Finally this hour, Disney's live-action remake of one of its classic films, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is out next week. First, the Hollywood premiere is scheduled for this Saturday, but the red carpet is going to look a little different than usual. Instead of being packed with paparazzi and media outlets, Disney is limiting access to only a few photographers and one house crew. Those scaled back plans because the film is now surrounded by controversy. For more on this, let's bring in entertainment journalist, pop culture expert Brian Balthazar. Brian, good to have you with us. So backlash against the film started years ago in 2021 when people made racist remarks against Disney's decision to cast Rachel Ziegler, who's Latina, in the lead role. Then last year, the film came under fire again from people like actor Peter Dinklage, who claimed that it reinforces negative stereotypes about dwarfism. Have Ziegler or Disney responded to any of these comments now as we get so close to the premiere?
Well, they've been kind of keeping their stars at bay quite a bit, which is evidenced by what we're going to see this Saturday. The truth is when you go on these premiere red carpets, there are tons of reporters, typically, and they all want a news-making comment. And unfortunately, it's hard to ask a question on this red carpet that won't result in one. We've seen both Rachel and Gal Gadot weigh in on the Middle East. We've heard stories of Rachel Ziegler talking about criticisms of the original movie and the portrayal of Prince Charming basically as a stalker. I mean, there's really very little that you can go to this event and not ask that won't result in some sort of polarizing comment that will take attention away from the film itself, or at least showcase it in a not so positive way.
Yeah, and really a reflection of just the times we live in right now. Politics playing a role in some of the controversy. Ziegler has promoted free Palestine messages on her social media. The evil queen, as you mentioned, played by Gal Gadot, who is Israeli, has been an outspoken supporter of Israel. We saw a picture a moment ago. They did appear together as presenters at the Oscars. Do we know if all this has had any impact on their relationship as co-stars?
There's no indication that their relationship has been compromised other than that they've stated their point of view and they're not being seen publicly other than at events where it's rather scripted. Like, obviously, that presentation of an award is very scripted. And so that was, one might argue that it wasn't the warmest presentation, but only they can speak for sure about how their relationship is going. Another thing we might add is Rachel Ziegler spoke out against President Trump and Trump supporters, wishing them no peace, which she later apologized for. So you can see that Disney now, which has a movie that some argue may not have ever been made. Honestly, maybe this was not the right time to bring this back and do a live action version of this. But you can see they're trying to say, let's stay away from any more polarizing comments. Let's just have our own crew there, have a select number of photographers that aren't going to get sound bites and just release photographs because it's just too much of a polarizing film right now for people.
Yeah. Despite all this controversy, we should note Snow White's official trailer has received more than 11 million views. Do we have an idea of how well this film might do at the box office?
Well, it's hard to say. I will say 11 million, that could be the fact that people are curious about the controversy. Will it send them to theaters? That's the big question. I think it's going to be a tough sell, to be honest. I think that there's so much bad press about this that I think people are going to stay away or say, I can wait until streaming. There's so many reasons that people may have to say, you know what, this one may not be for me.
And just remove the politics. There's also just this question, do people actually want live action remakes of these these animated films that they've loved for decades?
That's the big question, I think, right there. Exactly.
All right. Brian Balthazar, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it. That is going to do it for this hour of Morning News Now. Stay with us. The news continues right now. Good Thursday morning. I'm Joe Fryer. Savannah is on assignment. Right now on Morning News Now, President Trump's trade crusade crossing the Atlantic. The European Union now fighting fire with fire, slapping its own retaliatory tariffs on billions of dollars of popular American exports like beef, bourbon, even Harley-Davidsons. Comes as Canada ramps up hikes on additional goods made in the USA like computers and cast iron. How the commander-in-chief is handling it all and what it might mean for your bottom line. Plus, the waiting game. Astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunny Williams set to spend a little more time in orbit. NASA and SpaceX scrubbing the launch of their ticket back down to Earth. What went wrong and when liftoff could finally happen. Also this morning, an exploding measles outbreak continuing to tear through more than a dozen states. This morning, we're focusing on the long-term dangers of the virus, how it can actually wipe out a patient's immune system, causing an amnesia-like response when fighting off future diseases. And arrested development later in the hour, why some economists say an entire generation of adults is being held back from being a grown-up. Challenges that many 30-somethings are facing that might just revamp the definition of the American dream. We're going to start this hour with the trade war. It escalated overnight after Canada imposed retaliatory tariffs against America. President Trump is now vowing to respond against Canada as well as the European Union, which announced its own measures on Wednesday. NBC News senior business correspondent Christine Romans is here to talk about this, as well as signs that overall inflation might be slowing a little bit. Good morning.
And finally, a little bit of good news for investors. That improving inflation really important because there's been just a couple of weeks of big stock market losses. But these numbers don't capture the brunt of the president's new tariffs, with more expected next month. And we've been talking about Canada and Mexico and China, but now the European Union is retaliating against the president's trade moves.
President Trump's escalating trade war evolving into an international tit-for-tat, with the European Union now hitting back over the president's new levy on all foreign aluminum and steel, announcing retaliatory tariffs on American products worth billions of dollars, from beef to bourbon and even Harley-Davidsons.
Whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
The president slamming the move by the EU during an Oval Office meeting with Ireland's prime minister.
Will you respond to their retaliation?
Of course I'm going to respond. The EU was set up in order to take advantage of the United States.
Including Ireland? Is Ireland taking advantage of the U.S.?
Of course they are.
And this morning, Canada also pushing back, imposing a 25% duty on U.S.-made tools, computers, and cast iron products.
Make no mistake, today's decision by the U.S. will increase costs for consumers.
And Trump's 20% tariffs on China prompted retaliation from that country, too, targeting American farming and agriculture. Amid the trade drama, a respite on Wall Street with promising inflation numbers. The annual inflation rate improved slightly to 2.8% in February, but all calculated before any of the president's tariffs took effect.
Okay, so we talked about some promising inflation numbers, but not for eggs, right? Eggs still an issue?
These egg prices have really been just so troubling. And now we've entered the period of Lent, and we're going to have Easter when there's big demand. Look, when you look at a dozen eggs, that CPI number from yesterday shows $5.90 for the cost for a dozen eggs. That's up almost 60% from last year. But you dig in more recently, and USDA reporting some welcoming news that there hasn't been a new outbreak of avian flu in a couple of weeks. That's important here. And that more near-term wholesale egg prices seem to have, the gains have slowed or at least even falling a little bit. So we'll watch here closely, but we are heading into a period of big demand for eggs.
Exactly. I have a feeling maybe fewer families will be dyeing the real eggs this year, maybe going with like those plastic ones that you can stuff inside. Christine, thank you so much. Appreciate it. As the U.S. trade war with Canada heats up, frustration is growing among our neighbors to the north. Canadians have been skipping over American items at the grocery store, boycotting travel to the U.S., even booing our national anthem at sporting events. NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez is there with a closer look at the growing backlash.
Joe, good morning. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is here for a G7 meeting, while here in Canada, there is a profound sense of betrayal and defiance as their relationship with the U.S. grows even colder. In a country known for its politeness, this morning, growing outrage.
The world's perception of Canadians is that we are nice, but we also don't let ourselves be steamrolled.
Taking effect today, Canada's new 25% tariffs on more than $20 billion worth of U.S. goods. Retaliation for the Trump administration's steel and aluminum duties.
Together, we will do what we must do to protect Canada's economy.
The backlash mounting north of the border.
This is my last bag of American product.
Social media erupting with calls to buy Canadian and boycott USA.
It's on. I am shopping anything but USA.
American exports at grocery stores shunned. Some provinces banning the sale of U.S.-made alcohol. Vacations to the U.S. are being put on hold, too. The number of Canadians driving across the border dropped by 23% last month. Air travel down more than 2%. The U.S. Travel Association has warned just a 10% drop in Canadian visitors could mean more than $2 billion in losses. Canadian companies like this metal processor hit hard. If you had a message for President Trump, what would it be?
Why are you doing that?
And while President Trump has repeatedly floated annexing our neighbor to the north,
Canada should honestly become our 51st state.
many Canadians are vehemently opposed to the idea and now say they feel more united than ever. Basketball and hockey fans booing during the U.S. national anthem. But some Canadians cheering when one of their politicians threatened to cut off electricity to 3 U.S. states before later backing off.
If he really tries to hurt us, we'll just cut off his electricity. He'll have to take the stairs up Trump Tower.
Still, many we spoke with stress their anger is directed not at Americans, but at their government.
We respect America. We love them. We are not the 51st state. We will never become the 51st state.
In addition to the G7 foreign ministers meeting here, Canadian officials are heading to Washington today to meet with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. They say they want to lower the temperature. Joe?
All right, Gabe, thank you so much. The Trump administration continues to change the landscape of the federal government while shrinking its workforce. Mass layoffs are underway this week at the Department of Education, all part of President Trump's efforts to eventually abolish the agency and return control of education back to the states. Now, this all comes as Congress faces a Friday deadline to approve a government spending bill or risk a potential shutdown. NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Hake joins us with all the very latest. Garrett, good morning.
Hey, Joe, good morning to you. And look, these are related issues. The Democrats say they don't want to give a blank check to Donald Trump and Elon Musk to just keep slashing the federal government. And they don't want to pass a spending bill they fear the president could simply ignore. But the Republican-controlled House has already passed the GOP spending plan. They've left town, leaving this shutdown standoff now in the Senate.
This morning, with a government shutdown looming this weekend, President Trump facing a major battle on Capitol Hill. Senate Democrats saying yesterday they will not back a government funding bill written by Republicans and passed in the House on Tuesday.
Our caucus is unified.
Pushing instead for both parties to pass a short extension and keep working.
That will keep the government open and give Congress time to negotiate bipartisan legislation that can pass.
President Trump has advocated for the Republican bill, which boosts defense spending while making other cuts.
We are going to continue to work hard. We will continue to stick together and get this job done.
Both sides have until Friday night to reach a deal. The new defiance from Democrats marking one of their most high-profile showdowns yet with Trump. Coming amid deep distress within the party over the massive cuts his administration and top ally Elon Musk have made in their efforts to reshape the government. The latest big change coming overnight to America's climate and energy policy.
Today, I'm pleased to make the largest deregulatory announcement in U.S. history.
The head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Lee Zeldin, announcing that the agency will re-examine many of its core rules, which he called suffocating.
Today, the Green New scam ends.
Possibly affecting everything from electric vehicles to air quality standards to water pollution rules and climate change policy. And it comes as the fallout continues at the Department of Education, which faced massive cuts this week, including losing 6 regional offices, half the Office of Civil Rights, and 300 jobs in the Federal Student Aid Office, which handles student loans and grants, union officials say. The president saying he wants to move education to the states and making this claim without evidence about federal workers.
I feel very badly, but many of them don't work at all. Many of them never showed up to work.
Anthony Badiel Luna, a Navy veteran and Department of Ed probationary employee fired in February after just a month on the job, responding.
It's pretty disgusting how, they're talking about federal workers when obviously it's not the case.
It could take some time to sort out all of the impacts of the gutting of the Department of Education. Remember, President Trump says he wants to abolish the agency entirely and send all of its functions back to the states, but that would take an act of Congress and require a level of bipartisan agreement that remains well out of his reach for now. Joe?
All right, Garrett, thank you so much. A federal judge appears to suggest he might grant a request to reinstate thousands of fired federal workers, at least temporarily. This after hearing arguments yesterday in court that the layoffs by the Trump administration were unlawful. NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach joins us now from Washington with more on this. Gary, good morning. So the federal government has let go about 200,000 of these probationary employees. These are workers who were recent hires or took on new positions. Walk us through some of these arguments we heard in court yesterday.
Hey, good morning, Joe. Yeah, this was a lawsuit that pertains specifically to those probationary employees. We do expect the judge to rule sometime later today. But if you're going to fire a probationary employee, there's very specific ways you have to do that. And plaintiffs are saying those were not followed. There's 3 ways here. 1, if they lied about something on their application and they were still in the early months of their employment, they can be removed. 2, if there was documented poor performance by those employees during those first few months or years of their employment, they can absolutely be removed. And 3, if there was a reduction in force, a RIF, as we've been calling it, and you may have heard that phrase used, if there's a documented reduction in force happening across an agency or across a department, but there's very specific procedures as it relates to how that goes through as well. The government, for their part, says this wasn't a reduction in force. This was simply a termination of probationary employees. Joe?
So, Gary, several Democratic attorneys general urged the judge to sign a temporary restraining order to bring back these fired workers. They're arguing the government ignored proper protocol for the mass termination of federal employees known as a reduction in force. Explain that to us.
Yeah, so this is not about not being able to fire federal employees. It's just being about, if you're going to do it, how to do it properly. And there's 3 ways that the judge talked about and the plaintiffs talked about as well of being able to do that. 3, if you're planning a RIF, agencies have to sort of rank their employees based on their veteran status, based on their length of employment. If they had positive performance reviews, they're ranked, then they get to essentially compete for potentially open jobs. That's all on top of a 60-day waiting period and a notice period that you have to give that employee that they are being RIFed, that they are having a reduction in force. None of that, plaintiffs say, happened at all in these cases.
Bottom line is we're still continuing to see these mass layoffs all across the federal government. That includes now the Department of Education, which Garrett just reported on a moment ago. So where does this all go from here? What is next for these probationary workers?
So specifically as it relates to the Department of Education, it's sort of a little bit of a tricky situation because they are a named defendant in this suit, meaning whatever the judge decides today he wants to do, it's going to apply to the Department of Education. But if that department is going to end up being abolished by Congress in 60 or 90 or 120 days, these employees may get their jobs back just to lose them again. Joe? All
right, Gary Grumbach, thank you so much. The urgent search for a missing college student is expanding this morning after she suddenly vanished while on spring break. Now, the sheriff in her hometown says a person of interest has been identified in her disappearance, but the Dominican Republic National Police said this morning that no one is considered a suspect in this case. NBC News national security analyst Clint Watts joins us live with the latest. Clint, good morning. So authorities not saying any crime was committed here. Based on your experience, what are the possibilities of what happened here? What are we exploring?
They're trying to build out that timeline and match it to evidence. You see this with what we do know, 4 a.m. video surveillance camera footage, and then later on, closer to 9 a.m., some more footage, the girl is not there. So they're trying to build that timeline out, identify and canvass any and all witnesses. Also, we shouldn't get misled. What we don't know is alive or passed away. We don't know the actual condition of this student. And while there has been no confirmation one way or another, people might lean one way or another, until you actually know, you don't actually seal off any of those investigative lines of effort. So I think the key thing now is staying wide for the investigation, waiting for the facts to come in, and really canvassing all of those witnesses and re-interviewing those that were there that night.
It has now been a week since she disappeared. Talk about how big of a factor time is in a case like this.
It's a huge factor. Even knowing from a potential time of disappearance, if you're involving in one of the scenarios is that she may have passed away from drowning, every single hour that she may be out there, or the body may be out there, the drift, the currents that might take that actual body somewhere just expands more and more. The more it expands every hour, the more search needs to be conducted, the more difficult it is to come to some sort of conclusion.
For investigators, Clint, does it raise any red flags that it took friends about 12 hours to report her missing?
I think that in just looking at the hours and the timeline, we would maybe say yes, but we do need to remember this is spring break. All evidence points to there was probably some drinking. It was very late at night. If they left at different times in the darkness, they don't really know. And then just looking at when they thought maybe someone might show back up again, 24 hours, I think, isn't unreasonable in a spring break scenario that we might be looking at.
As this investigation moves forward, what is it that authorities are focused on right now, do you think?
They're going to look for two things. One, just increasing that evidence trail. Any other witnesses that were down at the beach? The news that we've been talking about, we're very focused on what we do know. There's a lot of unknowns. That's a beach that's got probably many people traveling back and forth, maybe down there at that time. The second part is the search for a possible body if she has passed away. Getting that, because having the body eliminates many of the other investigative lines that they might be looking at.
There is this sort of discrepancy, the hometown sheriff saying there's a person of interest, the Dominican Republic police saying there's no suspect. We should remember there's a difference here. A person of interest and a suspect are different things. Should we read much into that discrepancy there?
I wouldn't read much into it because you're talking about two different nations and how they do investigations, probably codifying things in different ways. And at the same point, we've got the FBI and other federal assets that are going down there to help with the investigation, probably closer to the scene, also better access to witnesses. So I would just wait to see if there are more details that come out today.
All right, Clint Watts, appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you so much. 21 million people in California are under flood watches this morning as heavy rains drench parts of the state that are still recovering from the recent fires. Preparations are underway along the Pacific Coast Highway as tens of thousands of people are under evacuation orders and warnings. Officials say the burn-scarred land is still unstable and could be prone to landslides. Meanwhile, in the northern part of the state, forecasters are predicting up to 3 feet of snow in places like the Sierra Mountain Range, which could make some roads there impassable. More on California's flood watch. Here's a morning news now weather. Meteorologist Angie Laskin joins us now with a breakdown of the incoming rain, winds, and so much more. Angie, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. We've got a lot of that going on, and we're going to add even severe weather to that list here as we get through the next couple of days, all from the same storm system. So what we've got right now, a whole lot of flood alerts up for Southern California. No surprise, they got a good dose of rain yesterday, and it lasted into the evening hours to last night and even into this morning. So 21 million people under these flood watches. We do have a couple of flash flood warnings there just east of Mission Viejo. Notice the heavy rain that's ongoing right now. Los Angeles to Mission Viejo, Oceanside, San Diego, all seeing some of that. Much of that rain is going to work its way to the east, and we'll see some quieter conditions for our friends in Southern California as the day goes on. But they've got to get through the flood risk this morning. The system shifts east. It does bring some rain and snow from essentially the Rockies to points of the desert southwest. That's where we'll see the impacts through the day today. And then we really ramp up that severe weather potential as we get into tomorrow, specifically late day Friday. We're going to see that threat for strong storms. It'll be the potential will be there for strong winds and tornadoes as well. We'll show you some of those impacts here in a moment. But even as we look ahead to Saturday, the system's still moving east and bringing all that heavy rain with it. And again, the potential for some strong storms. For Saturday, focused from the Tennessee Valley to the Gulf Coast. But we will have the potential for tornadoes out there again. Sunday, less of a chance for severe weather, but still, it's not zero. It's still going to be out there. Florida to New Jersey could see that potential. And we're still going to see plenty of rain stretch from the northeast down to the southeast. Big picture look of your severe threat on Friday. 43 million people included in this. It's a big chunk of the country. It stretches from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. And we do, again, not just have those winds that could be damaging and cause down trees and down power lines, but we've also got the tornadoes that will be likely. And on top of that, they could be some strong tornadoes, EF2 or higher. As we head into Saturday, more of that, but shifting farther to the east. So remember, the Tennessee Valley to the Gulf Coast is where we'll watch for Saturday. If you have outdoor plans in this area, make sure you have a way to get those alerts. New Orleans, specifically Montgomery, Mobile, Birmingham, Nashville, Louisville, all included in this. And we'll see, again, the same kind of threats of the winds, the tornadoes, and even some damaging hail of 2 inches or larger. Now to some good news, some fun kind of news. We've got a total lunar eclipse happening tonight, so let's talk about it. As we get into the overnight hours, 1 o'clock, we'll start to see that partial eclipse begin. The farther we get into the overnight hours, we'll see things kind of progress, and we'll get that total eclipse to start at 2:26 a.m. Now, this is a blood moon, so that'll mean that it'll have this kind of little reddish tint. Any sunlight from the Earth that is not covered will kind of give that tint to the moon. And then that'll all start to end when it comes to 3:31 a.m. So this is Eastern time, so make sure that you're planning and setting your alarm if you want to get out there and see it. It'll fully end, that partial eclipse ends around 4:47, just before 5 o'clock. How about the forecast, though? This is always, a talker when it comes to folks that really are enthusiasts for stargazing and lunar eclipse gazing. We've got mainly clear conditions across the Midwest, Chicago, Minneapolis, Oklahoma City even. You guys are going to see really clear conditions. Doesn't look great out towards the West Coast because we've got more rain, more clouds that we'll have to deal with. And across the Rockies, we'll see some of that snow. So you're not going to get great viewing conditions there either. Total overcast is what we're going to get for the Northeast. I'm so sorry. I'm one of those people that's bummed about this. And we'll see some rather cloudy conditions for our friends in the Southeast. So again, Oklahoma City, Rapid City, Minneapolis.
We're heading to Minneapolis.
Let's go.
Here we go. Road trip.
Your hometown.
Very good. All right. We won't have another one for like a year or so, right?
That's right.
Is that right? All right. Angie, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Speaking of up in the sky, this morning, the 2 astronauts who've been in space far longer than they ever imagined will have to stay in orbit a bit longer. It's because last night, NASA and SpaceX scrubbed the launch of a rocket that's supposed to bring a relief crew to the space station. Now, mission managers are trying to determine when to try again. NBC News senior correspondent Tom Costello was there for the attempt last night. Joins us from the Kennedy Space Center. Tom, what are you hearing?
Joe, they're going to try for 7:03 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow night. They've decided today it's a bit too windy. But before they can try, they need to understand the problem, dissect the problem, and fix it. It's not with the rocket. The problem is with a hydraulic issue on the clamp arm that holds that rocket in place to the ground structure. So that's the issue, right? And right now, Crew 10, made up of 3 astronauts and a cosmonaut, they're in quarantine, they're waiting. They can't leave to go up to relieve Butch and Sonny until this issue is resolved. That means they stay on the ground. Butch and Sonny are still up there. Under perfect Florida weather, Mission Control said Crew 10 had a 95% chance of launching as 3 astronauts and 1 cosmonaut strapped into their SpaceX Dragon capsule. But then at T-minus 43 minutes, bad news.
At this time, we are standing down from today to further address hydraulic release data.
Mission Control announced it was scrubbing the launch, all due to a problem with a hydraulic line on a clamp arm. Once on station, Crew 10 will relieve Butch and Sonny's Crew 9, allowing them to come home. Former NASA astronaut Mike Massimino.
We used to say when you're sitting on the launch pad, you never know you're really going to go until the solid rocket's light.
Sonny and Butch insist they always prepare for the unexpected. Still, an unexpected 9-month stay is a long time away from home.
My youngest is a senior in high school. I'm missing her senior year. That's the lowest, the downest point for me.
I have 2 Labrador retrievers right now, Gunner and Rotor, who have been having boy time with my husband, and I think they'll be very happy for Mom to come home.
While there's no problem with the SpaceX Dragon rocket, it's been a challenging year for SpaceX. A very different rocket, Starship, has exploded twice in test flights so far this year. Now a delay for Crew 10. Astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, Japanese astronaut Takuya Onishi, and Russian cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. Last night, all 4 climbed out of their capsule and, under police escort, returned to their quarters at KSC. waiting for word.
Sorry about the unfortunate result today, but we'll get you back up here in the air soon.
All right, so Tom, at some point they will crawl back in. What comes next now for this crew in Florida as they wait the all clear to fly to the ISS?
So they're in quarantine. If they were to suddenly say, guys, you need to wait a week, if that were to happen, they have a pretty nice beach house not far from here, all to themselves, an astronaut beach house. They can bring their families. It's beautiful, I'm told. I've never been there, never been invited. But that's the plan. Now, that's only if they have to stay for a prolonged period. If they lift off tomorrow night, Butch and Sunny could splash down off the coast of Florida, perhaps on Wednesday, Joe.
Tom, maybe you'll get that invite today. I've got my fingers crossed for you.
I'm working on it.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Tom. Much more to come on this hour of Morning News Now. A little later, we're going to learn about some of the long-term complications of measles as the number of cases in several states tick higher this morning. First, after the break, key peace talks between Moscow and U.S. officials today after Kyiv backed that 30-day ceasefire plan. But is Vladimir Putin ready to come to the table and make a deal? We've got the latest next. Welcome back. U.S. officials are in Moscow this morning to discuss a Ukraine-backed ceasefire proposal that would see a 30-day pause in fighting. The talks come as Moscow says it has pushed the Ukrainian army out of the biggest town in Russia's Kursk region. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel has the latest from southern Ukraine.
Here in Ukraine, all eyes are now on Vladimir Putin to see if he will accept a U.S.-sponsored peace proposal, which Ukraine says it is fully committed to.
President Putin doesn't look like a man ready for a truce, and he doesn't sound like one either. Dressed in fatigues, visiting his forces in the Russian province of Kursk. Putin said his main priority is to defeat the enemy in the shortest time possible. He says Russia may also need a security zone along its border. Russian troops have made rapid advances in Kursk, the only part of Russia partially occupied by Ukrainian forces, after President Trump cut off the flow of American intelligence to Ukraine. Kyiv depends on U.S. intelligence for targeting and defense. At the White House, President Trump says a team is heading to Moscow and expressed confidence that Russia will join the peace plan agreed to by Ukraine's President Zelensky.
I can do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. I don't want to do that because I want to get peace. I want to see peace.
But does Putin? Many Ukrainian officials have expressed skepticism Putin will accept an immediate truce while his forces are advancing, and believe he will likely seek preconditions and incentives. Ukrainian forces are still fighting as well, keeping up the pressure on Russia.
This soldier is scanning the sky for Russian drones. Even with all this talk of a ceasefire, soldiers out here say they're seeing no let-up in Russian attacks.
They say it's time to give peace a chance.
Are Ukrainian troops ready for a ceasefire?
Yes, we are ready, says Andriy, a former cook whose wife and daughter are refugees abroad.
Everyone is waiting to see if Putin will also agree. What do you expect?
Russia's commitments are not worth the paper they are printed on, he said.
Russia announced this morning that it has recaptured the biggest town in Kursk. So while U.S. officials are pushing Vladimir Putin to pause the fighting, his troops are pushing ahead with an offensive.
All right, Richard, thank you so much. A group of Americans is back in the U.S. after being jailed in Kuwait for years. NBC News reporter Matt Bodner is in London with their journey home and some other international headlines. Matt, good morning.
Joe, good morning. This release follows a recent visit to the region by Trump's top hostage envoy. It's part of a broader push to bring home American citizens detained in foreign countries. This group, released by Kuwait, includes veterans and military contractors who spent years in jail on various drug-related charges. The release is seen as a gesture of goodwill from Kuwait to the United States. That's according to a representative of the group. The names and exact number of those released has not yet been made public. Moving along now to Brazil, which will host the upcoming COP30 International Climate Summit. That'll be in November. Authorities are under fire from activists and conservationists for electing to construct a new 4-lane highway cutting right through the Amazon rainforest to accommodate the influx of foreign visitors to the host city. Local residents say it will impact their harvests, and scientists say it can potentially segment and damage the ecosystem. The government is boasting of the project's sustainability credentials, however, it says it will ease congestion. And we'll wrap up this hour in Singapore. A local microbrewery called Level 33 has just been named the world's highest microbrewery by Guinness World Records. You may have already guessed, but the brewery is located on the 33rd floor of a Singapore high-rise. It's not easy to find space for a brewery in a dense city like Singapore, and this was the best option. Most of the equipment comes from Europe, but it was too big to fit in the building's elevator, so they actually got a crane to lift 12 tanks, 2 kettles, and a cooling machine to the top floor. The brewery's beers will now be sold with a Guinness World Record label attached to them. Joe?
That is very cool. It's a lot of work for some beer, but good for them. All right, thanks, Matt. Coming up, the long-term impact of measles as that explosive outbreak spreads to more than a dozen states. After the break, we're going to explain how the virus can actually cause something called immune amnesia, while wiping out your body's defenses. The doctor is in next. We're back with a look now at one county jail that could make millions of dollars from President Trump's crackdown on immigration. It's because the Department of Homeland Security now says its immigration detention centers are full from the number of arrests under the Trump administration. NBC News correspondent Antonia Hilton reports from Ohio.
This is what the cells look like. They're all the same.
In Ohio's Butler County Jail, Sheriff Richard Jones is eager to fill these cells.
Got a bed over here, little cabinet, sink.
Happy to provide a resource now that the Department of Homeland Security says its immigration detention centers are at capacity after ICE arrested 32,809 individuals since President Trump's inauguration.
Well, they have no jail space.
So they can't do mass deportations without sheriffs like you.
They need us, and we are willing to help. I shook hands with President Trump.
Right after Trump won the election in November, Jones contacted ICE and renegotiated a contract his jail had with the agency during the first Trump administration. Butler County now charges ICE for holding detainees, renting out its beds for a price per head, potentially bringing the county millions of dollars a year.
300 beds.
Yes, ma'am.
What are you charging?
As much as I can get. We're charging $68 a day, and that pays for my employees, pays for what they need.
Tack on another $36 per hour for transportation.
Is it about the money?
No, it's about doing the right thing. If you look at what these people, the crimes that they have committed since they've been here, what's it worth for somebody that's been murdered or somebody that's been raped?
Saidu So says he accidentally missed a court appointment that led to a deportation order in 2006. For years, his family sought to keep him in the U.S., but in 2016, he was convicted of a crime following a car collision. In 2018, ICE brought him to Sheriff Jones's jail in Butler County. He now lives in the Ivory Coast, separated from his daughter, a U.S. citizen.
Butler County, I'm still going through some trauma from Butler County.
He alleges staff at the jail beat another detainee until blood surrounded his cell.
What are you worried could happen to other people like you there?
Somebody's going to put hands on them. They will be beat up.
In a lawsuit filed in 2020 and still pending, other detainees shared experiences similar to So's. The sheriff's office denies all allegations, saying our staff are trained professionals and would not beat anyone. Jones has been reelected in this community 6 times, and for most of those years has had this sign right in front of his jail.
That's the legal designation. Illegal aliens. That's where they're at. So now.
Right, but it's not an amusement park. Is it dehumanizing to have this here for people to just gawk and stare?
I don't see anybody gawking.
Back in the migrant detention business, he's confident his Ohio community is with him. Antonia Hilton, NBC News, Hamilton, Ohio.
Now to the latest on the measles outbreak. Right now, there are at least 232 total cases across at least 15 states. And as public health officials try to slow the spread, there's growing concern about long-term complications associated with the illness. For more, let's bring in NBC News medical fellow Dr. Akshay Syal. Dr. Syal, good to have you with us. So first of all, let's just start with the latest on the outbreak. Do we know how quickly the virus is spreading right now and who's monitoring the situation?
Good morning, Joe. So, what we've been told is that the CDC, they have this branch of what they call disease detectives, frankly, who are down in West Texas, who have paired up with local and federal officials fighting this thing. But, Joe, the reason this is so contagious, there's a number we use in medicine called R naught. which means that, if one person has a virus, on average, how many people will they spread it to? And Joe, for COVID-19, before the vaccine, that number was about 3. If one person gets sick, they'll on average spread it to 3 people. But Joe, with measles, that number is 18. So this is many times more contagious than even COVID-19. So this is a really, really hard virus to stop once the outbreak sets in.
And a reminder why those vaccines are so important. So Dr. Sal, let's talk about long-term issues here. Measles can cause something called immune amnesia in some patients. So tell us, what is that? And is it something that happens to everyone who gets measles or just some?
Yeah, Joe, so we wanted to report this out for NBC News because we're seeing a lot of sort of narrative online that measles is just a rash, it's just a fever. Back when I was a kid, everybody got measles. I'm sure you've seen people say this. But, Joe, there's a very dangerous long-term complication here called immune amnesia. And what this means, Joe, is that, whenever we get sick with things like flu or COVID or we have, food poisoning, our body builds up antibodies and protection to those things. So if we get them again, we're better protected and we're better off to fight them. But, Joe, if you get a measles infection, everybody is at risk of something called immune amnesia, which means that measles can actually wipe out pre-existing immunity to other things, other non-related measles infections, for example, flu or COVID. You can lose antibodies to those things that you've gained, and that's a really, really worrisome complication of the virus, Joe.
Yeah, and that begs the question, if you do get immune amnesia, can the immune system then recover?
Fortunately, yes. But, Joe, in order to build up immunity to things, the downside is you have to get sick. So, for example, if you're a young child and you get measles and you recover, if you lose antibodies to a lot of other things and you're going back to daycare, you're at risk of getting these things again. There's so many germs and pathogens floating around in these environments that young children are in. And in order to build up that immunity that measles can wipe out, you have to get sick again. And that's a really, that's something that you don't really want to have to deal with.
Yeah, no kidding. So beyond these immunity issues, what are some of the other long-term complications of measles?
The big one, Joe, is a disease called SSPE. It's actually a disease that can show up anywhere from 7 to 10 years after a measles infection, Joe. And what it is it's brain inflammation, it's brain swelling, and it's universally fatal. Almost everybody who gets this disease does pass away. It is rare, but it is a long-term complication of measles that even if you were to get measles today, you were to recover, it could rear its ugly head 10 years down the line. So you never really know if you're out of the woodwork. Just another reason for everybody to get that vaccine, Joe. 2 doses are 97% effective at protecting against measles and some of these complications that we just talked about.
All right, Dr. Akshay Sayal, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Coming up, is it arrested development? After the break, why some economists say America's 30-somethings are far from being traditional grown-ups right now. So what exactly does the American dream look like for millennials in 2025? We're going to take a closer look next. We're back with a closer look at some of the factors that experts say are holding back an entire adult generation. Recent research shows that many Americans in their 30s are far from being a, quote, grown-up, which by the traditional definition means buy a house, get married, have kids. All 3 of these categories have seen steep declines in young adults. Some economists say 30-somethings simply can't afford it. They're battling things like rising inflation and an expensive housing market. But some analysts say it's more nuanced than that today's younger adults are a lot more uncertain about the future than previous generations. They point to things like climate change, polarized politics, artificial intelligence, and corporate power. Wall Street Journal reporter Rachel Wolf joins me now. She recently published a report that digs into some of these disparities between different generations of adults. Rachel, thanks for joining us. I read this, wanted to have you on to talk more about this. I think the point you make early in the article that I think is so important, you say, now as a mix of social and economic factors holds back an entire generation, what researchers once called a lag is starting to look more like a permanent state of arrested development. You spoke to a lot of experts about why so many 30-something Americans have this negative outlook of the future, why they feel stuck. What did you hear?
That it's really a mix of economic factors and higher expectations for what we think a good life looks like. Our parents faced more pressure than we did to follow a more narrow life path, so they kind of knew what their life would look like by the time they turned 35. We don't have that same pressure. There's a lot more openness to life looking all sorts of different ways. In a lot of ways, that's great, But in other ways, it makes it really hard to know what to do. And a lot of the 30-somethings I spoke to seemed really unsure about what would make them happy.
What do you think it is that's influencing their attitudes?
There are a bunch of different things going on. From all of my reporting, it really seemed to me like a mix of thinking that life would be better than it actually is, seeing what our parents achieved and expecting to get there more quickly, a little more easily than we've been able to, and then looking at the world around us and being really unsure of what the future holds. It's really hard to plan for a future that you don't entirely believe is going to happen. And so I think that the combination of these things is making a lot of people around my age look around and say, you know what, like, I'm okay as I am. I'm just going to hang out here. And that looks very different than the lives our parents created by the time that they were our age.
Yeah, and one of the topics we saw on the screen there that you could do a whole segment on is just young men struggling in the labor market. Let's talk about money, because you spoke to multiple Americans in their 30s. They live in different parts of the country. They all mentioned money as a challenge, but you noted in the article, if you adjust for inflation, they're actually doing better than their parents. So talk about some of the big financial obstacles that they do face.
It's a complicated story. There are real economic challenges. This generation entered the job market during the recession. They were held back by the pandemic. This is the worst housing market in 40 years. There are aspects of the traditional American dream that really are harder to achieve, particularly homeownership. But when you look at other phenomenon like marriage and kids, the story's a little bit more nuanced. It's not really that it's become more expensive to have kids. It's that our expectations for what we ought to provide children have grown so much. And so it feels like there's this really, really high barrier to hitting these milestones, whereas previous generations might have just done it, even if they felt like it might be a bit of a stretch financially. Our generation seems less likely to do that.
That seemed to be the attitude of older generations, like this is just the path, I'm going to take it no matter what, and that seems to be what's changed, which you outline so well. Exactly. I was also thinking about the fact that our parents didn't have to have streaming devices and expensive cell phones and laptops. There's so many more costs it feels like we have today. Real quick, we only have like 30 seconds here, but just talk about how the definition of the American dream has changed in today's 30-somethings versus their parents or even their grandparents.
Yeah, it's a lot less narrow than it once was. And again, that can be a really great thing. It's not spelled out for us that we must have a house, a career, kids, a spouse, all by age 35. We're kind of allowed to interpret it however we wish. There's a lot more openness. And at the same time, as more options comes with more freedom, it also comes with a bit of paralysis. And I think that we're seeing that more and more.
Pros and cons. Rachel Wolf, great article. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yep. All right, more money news now. Let's get to the latest read on unemployment this week. CNBC's Silvana Henao joins us with the numbers and some other financial headlines. Silvana, good morning.
Hey, Joe, good morning to you. Well, we are just getting the latest snapshot on the economy and the labor market. We start with the number of Americans filing for unemployment, falling slightly last week, indicating a still healthy U.S. labor market. Jobless claims fell to 220,000. That's 2,000 lower versus an expected 225,000 by economists. Now, meanwhile, U.S. producer prices were unexpectedly unchanged in February, but the cooling trend, it really is unlikely to be sustained as tariffs on imports are expected to raise prices of goods in the coming months. Economists had forecast the PPI rising 0.3% after a previously reported 0.4% increase in January. All right, well, a group of U.S. oil company executives will meet with President Trump next week. The American Petroleum Institute, which represents the industry, telling Reuters topics will include tariffs, trade, and exports of natural gas. The API includes oil giants such as ExxonMobil and Chevron. And rents in Manhattan are soaring. to record highs. Data from real estate firms Miller, Samuel, and Douglas Elliman show new apartment leases were signed for an average of $4,500 a month in February. That's up more than 6% from a year ago and $100 above the previous record that was set in the summer of 2023. Now, that's a major increase for the middle of winter when the rental market historically cools. More than a quarter of new leases were signed following bidding wars. Manhattan is the nation's largest apartment rental market. I'll send it back to you.
Coming up, a little inspiration as we close out the hour. When we come back, an 8-year-old's new beginnings after undergoing treatment for leukemia, and the NHL team in charge of transforming her and her mother's house into a home. Grab the tissues. That story's next. To end this hour, we're sharing the inspiring story of how one mother supported her daughter through a cancer battle. As NBC's Kaylee Hartung reports, the pair are now being celebrated with a very special gift.
She's my comforter, and I'm hers. Some days when you're just down, she'll say or do something that will lift you up. Now, I can't stay down in that rut.
8-year-old Rhonda Burns lifts herself and others up, including her mom, Joyce, even through a battle with cancer.
Had you ever heard the word leukemia before? But as I look at you sitting right here, I'd never know. How did Rhonda's diagnosis change the relationship between you two?
Even though I had been through leukemia with family members, it was different with a child having it. We were able to make it through with each other.
Rhonda became Joyce's foster child when she was 3 years old. At age 6, Rhonda was diagnosed with leukemia.
I had been through 156 kids as a foster parent, but this one was different. Once it was given to us that this child has leukemia, she couldn't go nowhere.
When the adoption became official.
Oh. Do not cry, though. That'll make me cry.
How do you look back on that moment?
Joyful.
Now 2 years after Rhonda's diagnosis, treatment has been going well, and she's looking forward to a new beginning. The family story resonated with Building Hope for Kids, an organization that renovates homes for children battling cancer. The group consists of the NHL's Philadelphia Flyers charities, the Flyers' Wives, St. Christopher's Hospital for Children, and local nonprofit Michael's Way. Together, they're transforming Rhonda's home to give that fresh start.
She's this amazing kid with this huge potential.
The Flyers' Wives, including Lindsay Hathaway and Bonnie Dillabaugh, are in charge of making the house feel like a home.
We've been by the house a few times, taking measurements, furniture shopping. It's been great.
What do you hope the Burns family feels when they walk into this new home?
I hope they just feel light, like there's space to grow.
I got a sneak peek of the home from President of Michael's Way, Chris McElwee, who's passionate about helping families affected by cancer.
I lost my brother Michael to leukemia, and it's always been a mission to take something that was bad and turn something good.
Over 2 months, the house has been completely redone, and now it's time for Joyce and Rhonda to see their home.
Welcome home.
Rhonda.
What do you think?
I love it.
Yeah.
Can you believe this is the same home?
No.
What do you see? What do you notice first?
Everything. So not only have a new kitchen, but we also extended the house out into the yard. And the upstairs is just amazing.
Oh, Lord, I got to go. This is too much.
Does this look like a place you can get comfortable?
Of course, we couldn't forget Rhonda's room.
Is this enough purple for you?
And even a playroom. The family was joined on this special day by everyone who made this possible, including a few Philadelphia Flyers and their wives.
Do you like the purple?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I've heard people say over and over and over to you today is you deserve this. How does that make you feel to hear that?
I can't believe it. I didn't know it would change this much.
Our thanks to Kaylee Hartung for sharing Rhonda's story. We should add the Philadelphia Flyers are part of Comcast Spectacor, which falls under NBC's parent company, Comcast.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.